Welcome to the Long COVID podcast with me, Jackie Baxter. I am really excited to bring you today's episode. Please do check out the links in the show notes where you can find the podcast website, social media and support group, as well as a link to buy me a coffee if you are able. You should not rely on any medical information contained in this podcast and related materials in making medical, health-related or other decisions. Please do consult a doctor or other health professional. I love to hear from you. If you've got any suggestions or feedback or just want to say hey, then please do get in touch. I really hope you enjoy this episode, so here we go. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Long COVID podcast. I'm delighted to be joined this evening by Dr Gavin Francis, who, as well as being a doctor, is also an author. So we're going to talk about his new book, Recovery, which is very long COVID friendly in terms of both subject matter and length, as well as some other things, I'm sure. So welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me on.
It's lovely to have you here. So to begin with, would you mind giving a little bit of an introduction to yourself and what it is that you do?
Of course. So my name's Gavin Francis. I'm a GP and a writer, and I divide my time between writing books, being a GP in Edinburgh, being a GP locum in the Orkney Isles, and I've written a few books about travel and about medicine, the latest of which is this book Recovery that we're going to be discussing.
That's amazing. I didn't realise you were in Orkney as well. That's awesome.
That's where I am at the moment, actually.
Oh, is it really?
Mm.
That's so cool. So could you give a little bit of introduction maybe to your book? Because you must have been writing this during the pandemic, I think. So were you aware of the, emerging condition of long COVID while you were writing it?
Yeah, of course. So last year I published a book called Intensive Care, which was a kind of pandemic diary seen from the perspective of general practice. Through that book, I was trying to chart some of the ways in which this profession that I love, GP, has been kind of thrown about the place. It's been in a whirlwind, bruised, transformed by all the stresses of the pandemic. And that book takes in just over a year of the events of the pandemic towards last summer. And as we moved into last summer, 2021, I was finding that more and more I was speaking to people about recovery, both recovery from COVID and recovery from the damaging effects of repeated lockdowns. Also the many conditions, I guess, people were having that they couldn't get into hospital because NHS transformed itself into a national COVID service, really. And so many waiting lists were lengthening and people were struggling with various chronic conditions. And so these were conversations, these recovery conversations were ones I was having again and again and again, talking about general principles of convalescence, which fit in with any kind of recovery, whether it's a viral infection like COVID or from surgery or from even a mental health crisis. So I wanted to put all my thoughts and explorations and reflections on that theme into one easily accessible book, which is what I hope I've done.
Yeah. I really enjoyed reading it personally. And you mentioned convalescence. What does that actually mean? And why are we so rubbish at it as a society?
Well, the word itself comes from a Latin root meaning to grow in strength or to recover strength, I guess. So it's my impression very much from my reading of medical history and from what we know about the way people approached recovery in the 19th and early 20th century, that before we had really good antibiotics and steroids and inhalers and antidepressants, the main way to fight illness was to rest the body and to build up the strength of the body. And we used to have convalescent hospitals, we had convalescent homes, we had sanatoriums. There was a whole culture around convalescence that recognized that sometimes to recover what we need is a good environment in which to do it. You need to think about your diet, you need to think about the right balance between rest and exercise. And something happened after the 1950s. We just gradually lost it. We began to get the idea that all you needed to recover was the right prescription. If you could just get the right drug in your hand, you would be fine, which isn't true at all. So although I don't really want to go back to the old days, of course, I don't want to give up all the fantastic gifts of modern medicine. But I do think that we've lost something when we threw out that old approach. So when you say, why are we rubbish at it? I think it's partly to do with the culture and the economy that we've got now that drives us so hard and thinks that taking time off is to be a slacker. So that's a terrible aspect of our current culture. And people have a really powerful sense that to be ill is somehow a waste of time, that you need to just get on with it somehow or pull yourself together or something like that, which couldn't be further from the truth, really. I also think because we've got that sense that you just need the right prescription, everything would fix itself if you just find it, but it's just not true. We need to give time and respect and space to the process of recovery, whatever it is that we're recovering from.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess it's a mindset thing that, how many times do we, oh, I've got a big day at work, I'm not feeling great, oh, well, I'll just push through. And we just do that because it's what is expected of us and what we expect of ourselves as well, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much. And, sometimes that works for short periods of time. And some people do push themselves through. And certainly if you look at different professions, sickness rates, there is huge variety in how much different kinds of professions are willing to take time off. But although it's occasionally possible to push through, you can just set yourself back and make things worse or set yourself up for a worse breakdown later on. It's something I see a lot in my own work.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've definitely noticed that with my long COVID experiences right at the beginning. There wasn't really that much knowledge about it, so I was sort of recommended to push on through. So that's what I did. And obviously, looking back almost 2 years, that clearly wasn't a very good idea. But I'd never experienced anything like that at the time, and I think the same is probably true for so many others.
Yeah, and so it's important to try and learn that new language of the body, learn by attending very carefully what it is that you can do and what you can't do. And it would be wonderful if there was a rule book that you could just pick up that would tell you exactly what you should be doing or what you shouldn't be doing. But everybody's so different and everybody's manifestations of illness is so different that it really is a matter of feeling your way with hopefully some guidance to exploring what you're capable of without exhausting yourself or setting yourself back.
Exactly, because yeah, it is very, very individual, and respect for our bodies as well. Because I think that's definitely a big thing for myself and some people that I've spoken to. You push on until you can't.
Yeah, and sort of learning to give respect to your body and to the process of healing is something that I think we don't do so much nowadays, that we just tend to think, oh, well, our bodies are quite mechanical, but it's not true, really. I think doctors are far more like gardeners than they are like mechanics. Nature does most of the work, and you can't just sort of reach into a body and fix something the way you can fix a machine. It has to be allowed to grow back into health somehow.
Yeah, that's a very reassuring way of putting it, actually. I like that. I mean, my experiences with doctors throughout my long COVID experiences have actually been quite good, but there are definitely some doctors who've been getting a lot of stick from long COVID patients for various reasons, I guess. I mean, as a doctor, how do you balance different types of support, reassurance, trying to find answers for patients with something that's a sort of emerging condition? It must be really difficult.
Yeah, I think it is quite difficult. I think it's one of the hardest things in medicine or in clinical practice. Because not only is there so many different kinds of enduring COVID symptoms, whether we're talking about fatigue or breathlessness or people who feel a kind of brain fog or just persistent coughs or changes in smell and taste. But so there's that sort of multiplicity and spectrum of symptoms that people might have. But at the same time, there's also so many different kinds of people, and their responses to all those symptoms are going to be so different. It's always been my impression as a GP that understanding the science of medicine is in some ways the easy part of the job, and it's far, far harder to learn how to appreciate and gauge what kind of doctor you have to be for each different patient. And I tried to write about this in the book the way that I'm sure that I've always felt that the really, really good doctors and nurses I've worked with in my career are ones that are capable of grasping in the first few moments of an encounter what kind of encounter they've got to shape. Do you know, is this someone in front of me that needs to hear the science and the latest knowledge? Or is this someone who just wants referral to a specialist? Or is this someone who wants a sort of gentle arm around their shoulders? Or is this someone who wants a real kind of problem-solving, collaborative approach? And it's definitely one of the great, great skills in medicine and nursing to figure out which kind of patient you're faced with and what's going to be the most effective way with that particular individual. You mentioned about the difficulty sometimes of working with an emerging condition, and we can fall back on some useful principles, of course, that as the medical profession we've learned from other conditions, principles that have proven useful, for example, in other kinds of post-viral fatigue, might be helpful here. But yeah, we're just drawing on principles, really. And we do need to try and keep up to date as far as we can with what the scientific community is learning about a new condition. And also, I know that across the country, there's different health boards are starting to develop different kinds of long COVID pathways. And so every different health board where you're living has probably got a slightly different approach. And this is evolving really, really quickly just now. I certainly get regular emails into my NHS Lothian inbox about the way that long COVID management pathways are evolving.
Yeah, and I guess, like you say, that everyone's so different. It must be a real challenge. But yeah, the idea of post-viral illness is actually not a new one, is it, really?
No, not at all. I mean, it's there in the writings of the ancient Greeks. You can see they're talking about people getting a fever and then feeling totally exhausted. And so I think it's just part of the human response to fighting infection. These are some of the symptoms that can be triggered. And we need to adjust our approach individually to each person, taking into account where we can, what their symptoms are and what their capacities are, and what their expectations are, because beliefs and expectations are also so powerful when it comes to illness and when it comes to recovery.
Yeah, for sure. And everybody's experiences and expectations are all, so very, very different. And I guess the people around them as well. I find it quite difficult to remember that there are other people around me who have also been very kind of affected by this whole thing. My other half has been amazing, but I can't pretend that it hasn't been really awful for him as well. And then there are people who've got children and people that they're looking after as well. So I guess that must be a huge aspect as well.
Yeah, of course. And some people can make modifications to their lives in order to try and accommodate to this process and these kind of principles that I'm talking about, and other people just can't, just because of the difficulties of their own economic situation or their social situation or their housing situation. And as a GP, sometimes all I can do is try and encourage things in the right direction, firing off letters as and when I can to try and assist. But yeah, for some people have got a much, much harder road than others.
Yeah.
We'll be right back. I'm interrupting myself for a second to tell you about long COVID breathing. The fabulous Vicky Jones and I have teamed up to bring you long COVID breathing. We are both passionate about sharing our expertise and experience of the breath and how incredibly helpful that can be with long COVID. We've worked together to develop a course that is specifically tailored to those with long COVID. It's a 6-week course with 12 sessions, all delivered online. The community feel and learning that we're all sharing is such a joy. To find out more information and to sign up for our courses, workshops and other shorter sessions, please check out the link below, longcovidbreathing.com, or email longcovidbreathing@gmail.com to start your breathing journey with us.
Definitely. I felt quite reassured actually when my GP turned round to me and he just honestly said, I don't know. But then he went on to try to help some of my symptoms. I don't like not knowing things either, which is probably why I started a podcast. But why is it so hard for us to admit that we don't know things?
Yeah, it can definitely be really hard for doctors to admit to uncertainty. Not, I think, because for most of them that they're proud or arrogant, I think they begin to feel anxious that for the patient to keep having faith in them, they have to project a kind of attitude of calm authority. And so some of them may try to put on the fact that they know more than they do, not because they're trying to deceive anyone, but because they're trying their best to help the patient. But there's, of course, doctors like your GP that's happy to admit it. And I hope I hope I'm happy to admit when I don't know. When you feel confident enough in the knowledge that you do have, sometimes that helps you hold on to a sense of uncertainty, or just to carry that sense of uncertainty together with, or even on behalf of your patient. So you can say, for example, you say, oh, I don't know, but I'll find out. Or I don't know, but I once had a patient with something similar and we did this. Or you can say, I don't know, but I've seen enough that this is not dangerous. This isn't going to be a life-threatening problem. And so even when you don't know, you can still offer a little bit of reassurance in some way. So much of medicine consists in trying to help people's symptoms, even though they have incurable conditions. And if a doctor expects to cure every patient they have, they're going to be disappointed. And if a patient expects the doctor to be able to cure everything, they're also going to be disappointed. So, like I was saying earlier, it's much better in many ways to think of doctors and nurses as kind of guides to the landscape of illness, rather than people that can just magic illness away. And I hope I can help my patients through some of those landscapes that I've seen before, but certainty is certainly in short supply right across medicine. Even if you've got access to huge batteries of tests and scans, you still can't be certain about all outcomes.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe it's this idea of putting medical professionals and probably others as well sort of up on that pedestal where you think this person is like a magician and he's going to fix everything. So maybe that's actually a lot of it is the fault of patients as well.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say fault's too strong, but certainly it's easy for in our modern culture where we've got all these hospital dramas on television and people see all this technology and they think that medicine's capable of miracles, which is really flattering, but then it means it's quite disappointing when you find out that it's not really capable of miracles, that our feet are very much stuck on the ground, and there's a lot that we don't know, and there's a lot that we can't cure. But on the other hand, we do know a lot, and the capacity of modern medicine to classify illness is really formidable. We can rule out really dangerous conditions or progressive conditions. We can find out all sorts of things about what your illness isn't. And that in itself can be a source of consolation or hope. And it can also be a source of finding a way through to meet with other groups of others who are suffering along with you. So even though modern medicine is full of flaws, it's still a very powerful approach to the body and to illness. And I think that's why it's been adopted across a great part of the world, really.
Yeah, once you've put a name on it. I remember speaking to somebody else and they were saying, well, why do you want to put a name on it? Does it really matter? Because, you know how you feel. What does it matter if you give it a name? And I was kind of thinking, yes, but if I know what it is, then I can research it and I can do a bit of Googling, which isn't always helpful. But, you can find other people in the same boat and then you have that kind of support, which has been quite helpful, I think, to a lot of people because, there are some answers out there, but there's a lot of unknowns as well. And people in the same boat can share ideas and sort of support each other as well. So I think that is quite important, isn't it?
Yeah, and for some people, the act of naming their illness, some people really want to know a diagnosis and some people really don't. And that's part of the trick I was talking about earlier about good clinicians trying to figure out what kind of patient they've got sitting there. I've got patients that absolutely don't want to know if that diagnosis isn't going to lead to some immediate sort of treatment plan. But I've got other patients that really like to know because they feel as if they know their illness has a name, that automatically means that it has an existence separate from themselves, and they find that less frightening. If you know that other people have suffered with a similar constellation of problems, it makes you kind of be able to relax and think, okay, this is a thing that's happened to others. It's not some terrifying force that might take over. It's actually a thing that other people have been through. And that in itself can be a great consolation, I think.
Yeah, and you said that the illness being separate to you, and I think that is quite a big thing with certainly with a long illness. You can kind of feel your life is just so taken over by the illness because it affects absolutely every part of your existence that I struggle to imagine myself not being ill, and it's almost like it's just taken over.
So do you find it helpful then to think of it as a condition separate from yourself?
I guess I do, and sometimes I have to kind of remember that I wasn't always like this. It's quite hard to remember the me before COVID. There is literally nothing I want to be more than the me before COVID, but it's becoming harder and harder to remember that. Yeah, it is almost like it's not separate to me all the time.
And so how do you feel when you read about others' experiences and read about the idea that there is this sort of emerging idea of a constellation of symptoms post-COVID? Does that feel more frightening to you, or does that feel like reassuring almost?
Bit of both, I think, for me. You hear about other people having symptoms, and it's comforting to know that there are other people there, and you hear what people might have done to help themselves, and you think, oh, I'll give that a try, that's great, and some of them will work and some of them won't. But also you hear people talking about symptoms that you haven't had yet, and I think, oh my goodness, am I going to get that one? So I think, yeah, both. It's sort of double-edged. Is it double-edged sword? That's the phrase, isn't it? But is there a way of trying to keep those two things separate? Is the sort of the naming of the condition that will help, of course, but how do you remember the you before the illness?
I don't know. I think that's a really interesting question, and it's going to be so dependent on the individual and what their particular symptoms are. Yeah, there's a section of this book talks about carers and those that are around you, and how important it is to be aware of their needs too, and find ways to support the carers and people around you. Whether that's through charities. Where I work in Edinburgh, there's a wonderful charity called Vocal, or whether it's through other kinds of networks that the carers and those around you can be supported. But it's with their help that you're going to be able to best find a new equilibrium, because those are the people who knew you best before, and they're the people who are going to be around you now and can help identify what the new balance is going to look like as you work towards recovery. And I do think that we need to think about recovery as a sort of dynamic process, like as a balance. And for some conditions, for many, many conditions that my patients have, there are progressive conditions, whether we're talking about even things like multiple sclerosis or certain kinds of cancers. And you could argue, well, how can you speak about recovery if somebody's got a progressive degenerative condition? And I still think it's possible to think about recovery in the sense of a dynamic that you're trying to move your life towards a place of more autonomy, more dignity, more in accord with your wishes, by setting achievable goals and working towards them. And so, although we tend to think of recovery as being something that's purely, returning to full health or returning to the way you were before illness, I don't think that's necessarily the most helpful way to think about it. And it's more helpful to think about it as a much more dynamic process and a balance, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And the word that comes up a lot in support groups is acceptance. And I hate this word. It took me a long time to realise that I wasn't necessarily accepting that this is me forever, but I have to accept that this is me at the moment, because if I keep fighting against it, then it's not going to help. But I think it's definitely a tricky thing.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting, and I think that's a very wise distinction about acceptance of the moment versus acceptance of a state being that is always going to be that way. Because the reality of the body is, as we've just been discussing, one of dynamism and change, and the body doesn't stay still at all. Even all the molecules in your body are constantly being replaced by other molecules, and we're all changing. None of us is getting any younger. And so any vision of the body that's static is an illusion. And in that itself, there's always a source of hope, because the body itself is constantly evolving and changing, and there's lots of potential to nudge it in the right direction as it does that.
Yeah, that's a nice way of thinking about it, yeah. I guess we've sort of touched on it already, but this idea of healing and recovery, which seems sort of open-ended, and certainly in my own experience, it's sort of almost never-ending. Is there a way of looking at things that will help us to allow our bodies the time we need, but without letting those kind of frustrations take over? Because, we can know that frustration isn't helpful, but doing something about that isn't always very easy.
Yeah, well, I do think it's really important not to compare your own progress towards health with other people, because everybody's so different and their recovery is subject to different kinds of pressures. And from the outside, looking at people, you've got no knowledge of what the forces at play in their own lives are. And it's tempting to look at people and get frustrated or impatient if they seem to be recovering more quickly than you. But then, you're different people with different situations and different pressures. So I would encourage to jettison comparisons, because they're not helpful. Also, there's a passage in the book where I talk a lot about this idea that healing and convalescence sometimes feels like a game of snakes and ladders, that you're working your way up this board towards the goal, which is health, just with random rolls of the dice. But the truth is that it's not really random, because with every kind of move of up and down the board, or move towards and away from health, you get wisdom, you gather experience, you learn strategies, and you learn triggers, which can help you the next time, because health isn't a game of snakes and ladders, thankfully. So I hope those ways of looking at recovery can help. This lack of comparison and this awareness of the dynamism of the whole process, and that actually there are things that are within your control. And so look to them and try to maximize them, even though they might seem frustratingly, the levers that you have control over might seem frustratingly small. Still try to make the best of the levers you do have. And that can itself restore a little bit of faith or hope in the whole process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you're right about the comparison thing. And I think for me, I compare myself to what I was before. And as well as to other people. And, even if I look at myself and I think, well, I have got slightly better and that's great. But then I'll look at what I could do before and think, well, I can walk around the block. I could walk up 6 mountains in one day before. So, why can't I do that now? I've got a bit better, but I'm not better enough. And like you say, that comparison is really not helpful. There's no point thinking about that. I need to think about where I am now. But again, easier said than done.
Yeah, no, good luck.
But yeah, no, that's really, really useful. I'm sure medical advice will differ person to person, and you'll probably be quite wary about giving any out. But do you have any general advice for somebody with long COVID, or I guess any long-term illness, just in sort of general terms?
Yeah, in very general terms, because obviously, I hope people can find a clinician that they trust and can speak to, whether that is a GP or a nurse or a physio. But sort of general advice that seems to work for most people in most situations, I think, is that learning to listen to your own body and its limits is a skill that a lot of people with chronic illness have to undertake, with varying levels of success. And it's hard at first if you're used to a body that just does whatever you ask of it. Having to learn a new kind of language of the body can be a slow process and quite a frustrating process. But I think it can be a really useful one too. And the other thing that I think is helpful for most people in most situations is to think carefully about the environment in which they're attempting to recover, to charge their environment with as much space and light and cleanliness as they can. Those old principles of the Florence Nightingale hospitals, where she wanted the wards to be well scrubbed and the bed sheets to be well starched and to look out over something green and growing and alive. These are all good reasons that Florence Nightingale wanted to do those things. And so I think we have to try and maximize those environmental aspects as much as we can and do our best to stay active within the constraints of the illness. Otherwise, the horizons of the possible start to shrink. And it is possible, as we've been discussing, to become quite isolated or frustrated with your limits. And we touched on the needs of carers and those around us who are indispensable. We didn't really touch so much on getting sick notes and time off work if you can. But that's something that if you can possibly get the right kind of benefits to get time off work, it can be really, really important. Being aware at the time that of course, work helps us in all sorts of ways, and it's possible if you're off work for months and months to get isolated, to become quite isolated, which isn't good for your mental health either. And I suppose we touched on the idea of clinicians and finding clinicians that you get on with. And I know a lot of people get very frustrated with trying to find a doctor or a nurse or a physio that they can trust. And it's my impression, and it may, I can't speak for, of course, I don't speak for my whole profession, but it's certainly my impression that most doctors, nurses, physios are trying their best within a very kind of resource-strapped system under huge pressure. And it's not easy to find a clinician that you get on with, but it can be a really important part of the process. And so if you really, really can't stand your clinician, see if you can find ways that you could change for another one. The last thing I suppose I would want to mention is that beliefs and expectations, as I touched on, are really powerful. What you believe about your illness and what you expect of yourself can have a huge impact on the way that you feel. So be careful about who you listen to and try to find the authorities that you can trust. I'm really convinced that as human beings, we all understand the world through stories and arcs of stories, and though not all of them have any kind of fairy tale ending, we do have the ability through those kind of levers we discussed to write a little part of our own story. And I would encourage all your listeners to explore ways of doing that as best as they can. And I wish them all the best with it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. There's some really wise words, I think, there. Certainly some tips that I'm going to be trying to take on board a bit more. So, yeah, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you. And hopefully anyone who hasn't already read it will be heading off in search of a copy of your book as well.
Okay, well, thank you, Jackie. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much to all of my guests, and to you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, or at least found it useful. The Long COVID podcast is entirely self-produced and self-funded. I'm doing all of this myself. If you're able to, please go to buymeacoffee.com/longcovidpod to help me cover the costs of hosting the podcast. Please look out for the next episode of the Long COVID podcast. It's available on all the usual podcast hosting things. And do get in touch